Hi, welcome to Al-Muqaddimah. My name is Siavish. 3 years ago, I made a video answering the question, did Prophet Muhammad exist? Dear God, it's been 3 years. Well, in that video, I looked at some non-Islamic sources that were near contemporary to show that Prophet Muhammad did in fact exist and was a real historical figure. This is also the view of the vast majority of scholars, both Islamic and Western. But there's a serious problem of chronology with the life of the Prophet. While certain parts of the Sunni Islamic tradition quite neatly wrap his life in a bow of time, beginning with the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal, the third month of the Islamic calendar, in 571 CE, and ending with the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal, 632 CE. The truth is that it's not all that straightforward where secular scholarship of his life is concerned. The date of his birth is all but impossible to determine. When he was born, of course, no one made a birth certificate for him, and his parents didn't know that a prophet was born in their home whose birth anniversary would be significant one day. Other than that, it's probable that his parents didn't even know how to read and write. So expecting them to have written it down or for it to be recorded in some way is frankly quite unreasonable. However, the day that he passed away was surely significant. He had a large community of followers who were devoted to him, and it was quite a major event, so surely his followers were adamant to remember the day of his passing. Islamic tradition does indeed tell us a lot about his passing. We know of his brief and sudden illness, we know of his passing, we know of his funeral, and we even know the reactions of some of his incredibly bereaved followers. So, when did Prophet Muhammad pass away? Well, there's two complications with the date of his death. There's one minor complication and a major complication. The minor complication is just the conversion of the Islamic calendar, which is used by Islamic sources, into the Gregorian calendar, which we use today. This creates ambiguity of around 2 years, which means that the year of his death is either 632 or 634. I'll return to it in another video where we'll discuss the details of the Prophet's death as found in the Sunni Islamic tradition. The major complication, however, is that Islamic sources make it very clear that the Prophet passed away and his successors then invaded the greater Middle East, that is, Roman Syria and Sassanid Iran. However, some 10 or so non-Islamic sources, which were actually written earlier than Islamic sources, put Prophet Muhammad in Palestine, leading the invasion himself. This offsets the date of his death by 3 or so years. So in this video, we'll take a look at how Islamic and non-Islamic sources clash on the death of the Prophet Muhammad. This video is brought to you by, well, all of you. Thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel and making these videos possible. Al-Muqaddimah is funded only by Patreon, and as you can see, the videos take a long time to research, edit, and produce. It's only because of my patrons that I can put this kind of time into these videos and keep them free from any kind of paywall. So if you want to pledge $1 or more to support the channel, you can head over to my Patreon. The link is in the description. You can also become a member right here on YouTube. There are no benefits attached to it because I don't get the time to work on them. So if you want to support Al-Muqaddimah financially, please go ahead. Otherwise, just like, comment, share, and subscribe. That's also supporting Al-Muqaddimah. This video is part of my series known as The Historical Muhammad, and it's one of 3 videos that will talk about the Prophet's death, so be sure to subscribe to know when those videos come out. This video will only talk about the non-Islamic sources that put the Prophet in Palestine, leading the invasion. The next 2 videos will talk about early Islam and its interactions with the Roman/Byzantine Empire and the traditional account of the Prophet's death. Let's get started. The history of early Islam covers the period between 610 CE, when Prophet Muhammad began his duties as a prophet, and around 750 CE, when the Abbasid Caliphate came to power. This almost 1.5 century period is, of course, the era in which much of Islam crystallized. This is the period in which the Quran was compiled, the definition of a Muslim was clarified, and the teachings of Prophet Muhammad were edited into a canon. Today, the historical study of this period has two main types of sources, those written by Muslims and those written by non-Muslims. This has led to something of a spectrum of scholars. On the one side, we have scholars who believe that Islamic tradition, meaning the sources written by Muslims, are completely true and tell us reliably what happened in this period. On the other side, we have scholars who believe that Islamic tradition is not at all reliable, but instead we should rely on non-Islamic sources, meaning sources that were written by Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians who lived in Syria, Egypt, and Palestine. The people who favor Islamic tradition argue that non-Muslims were on the losing side of the Arab conquests and were hence understandably quite salty, so they might not be truthful in their recording of the history of this period. On the other side, the people who favor non-Islamic sources argue that given that for Muslims, the history of Islam is a matter of religion and life in this world and the next, we cannot expect Muslims to have been completely truthful while recording this history. They were looking at things through the lens of religion. Now, these are two extremes, but most scholars exist somewhere in between the two extremes. The closest scholars to the right would be the religious scholars who believe in Islamic tradition as part of their faith. The closest scholars to the left would be Patricia Crona and Michael Cook, who wrote a book called Hagarism in 1977. However, both Patricia Crona and Michael Cook shifted away from the extreme since that time. The reason that I'm putting Hagarism on the extreme left is that while Islamic traditionalists, the one on the right, treat Islamic sources uncritically, Hagarism does the same with non-Islamic sources. Crona and Cook tried to come up with a history of Islam based only on non-Islamic sources, and they have been criticized for not being critical and cautious enough with those sources and taking them at face value. This is something that Crona and Cook also seem to agree with later in their lives. People more on the right side of the spectrum are called Islamic traditionalists, while the people on the left side of the spectrum are called revisionists. Now, one of the most influential works in the field of early Islamic studies in the past 50 years has been Robert Hoyland's book, Seeing Islam as Others Saw It, in which he translated, compiled, and commented on some 800 pages worth of non-Islamic sources and made them available to the public, which has opened many new avenues of early Islamic studies. Seeing these non-Islamic sources, many scholars have come to understand that there are many unusual differences between the narrative told by Islamic tradition and what these non-Islamic sources tell us. Of course, you do find that natural saltiness that you expect from these non-Islamic sources. For example, they call the Prophet all kinds of bad things, but they also differ on things that seem to have no clear purpose behind them. The death of Prophet Muhammad is one of them. Most revisionists today don't believe that either of the two types of sources is fully reliable and work with both of them to craft a narrative that fits both. One of the most influential books on this topic is Fred Donner's Muhammad and the Believers at the Origins of Islam. I have read that book 5 times in 3 years because of how interesting it is. Keep in mind that I'm not saying that I agree or disagree with any of this. You're free to believe whatever you want. Stephen Shoemaker, a leading figure in the revisionist study and a scholar whose work we'll be returning to in this video, perfectly sums up how historical study works in his book, Creating the Quran. He writes, "Prove is, of course, a loaded term. Historians are rarely able to prove absolutely that something did or did not happen, particularly for matters of great antiquity or when dealing with the formative history of a particular community, which is often a very active site of shifting memories. Instead, historians seek to identify reconstructions of the past that seem to be more or less probable, using various critical methods of analysis and logical reasoning. Proof of something almost always escapes us." So no one is claiming that this is the absolute truth of the history of early Islam. History is a science, and science relies on evidence. Historians study what evidence tells us and sometimes what the lack of evidence might suggest, but the absence of evidence is of course not the evidence of absence. Also, actual historians don't go into details about God and his works. It's a matter of historical fact that Prophet Muhammad existed and preached in Arabia. However, whether the angel Gabriel appeared to him or not is not a matter that concerns historians. It's a matter of faith. Some things are left to assumptions, whether you assume that God exists and he sent Prophet Muhammad, or whether you assume that Prophet Muhammad wrote the Quran himself, are frankly, in the eyes of the historians, assumptions of equal weight and are usually not critically analyzed. Scholars won't say that Prophet Muhammad somehow plagiarized biblical sources to write the Quran. They would simply point out the similarities between the Quran and biblical sources, wherever they exist. Muslims explain that away as similarities simply between two Abrahamic religions. So let me give you a summary of the revisionist narrative of early Islamic history. Keep in mind that, like Islamic tradition, this isn't a single canon, but rather disagreements exist among scholars. The summary here is from Fred Donner's book that I mentioned before. Islam began with a prophet named Muhammad who lived in Arabia, Mecca to be precise. And yeah, Mecca it is. No academic scholars other than David King take Dan Gibson's idea of Petra being the original home of Islam seriously. Even most revisionists believe in Mecca and Medina to be the original heartlands of Islam. According to Fred Donner, the Prophet was originally not preaching a new religion. Rather, it was a monotheistic religious movement that at its beginning seems to have two basic ideas at its core: the oneness of God and the impending end of days. If you look at the earliest chapters of the Quran, they do simply talk about these 2 points with details of heaven and hell here and there. Now, Prophet Muhammad's followers weren't called Muslims, but rather mu'minun, meaning believers. The term Muslim does appear in the Quran, but it doesn't appear in historical sources till quite a bit later. So the term believers is used to refer to the followers of Prophet Muhammad at this point. So the fundamental ideas of this believers movement were that there's only one God, and this world is corrupt and doomed. So we must create separate communities where we implement the laws of God before the end of the world, which was impending and gonna be any day now. Only God knows when it's going to happen. This community was universal, meaning it was open to everyone as long as you were a monotheist. Hence, Christians and Jews could and did join it without becoming what we now think of as Muslims. Medina was the first of these separate communities that was governed by the laws of God. Now, since the end of time was impending, the land of Palestine had to be taken from the corrupt Romans, who had distorted the Christian faith to prepare for the arrival of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, or Isa as the Quran calls him. The believers saw themselves as the rightful heirs of that land because, well, Jews were descendants of Abraham and so were the Arabs. And yeah, that seems to have been established quite early on, even before Islam, that Arabs, especially in the northern and western parts of Arabia, were descendants of Ishmael or Ismail, the son of Abraham. So due to this belief, according to Fred Donner and other revisionists, the central point of the believers' movement, their ultimate kingdom, was in Jerusalem. Mecca and Medina might not have held the same value to them as they do today to the Muslims. Today, Jerusalem is the third holiest site in Islam behind Mecca and Medina, but back then it was Jerusalem at the top of the list. Now this brings us to the death of Prophet Muhammad. According to the sources that we're gonna take a look at in this video, Prophet Muhammad was there when the land of Palestine was conquered. So why doesn't Islamic tradition say that? Well, it's simple. When Palestine was conquered by Prophet Muhammad, the end of days was expected, but when that didn't happen, later writers simply removed that part and put the death of Prophet Muhammad shortly after the conquest of Mecca to glorify Mecca and not Jerusalem as the central point of Islam. This was also poetic because conquering the holiest of places for Muslims, Mecca of course, would be the completion of the Prophet's divine mission, and the rest would be carried out by his successors and not him. Hence, giving the cities that the Prophet personally controlled, Mecca and Medina, primary importance and all the other cities, especially Jerusalem, secondary importance. So that was a quick summary of the revisionist version of early Islamic history. If you want to learn more about the topic, do check out Fred Donner's amazing book. The sources that we will be talking about here aren't always nice to Prophet Muhammad and do use some insults for him and call him all kinds of bad things. If that's disturbing to you and your religious sentiments, I urge you not to watch the rest of the video. Let's now take a look at those early sources. Previously, in a video, I talked about Doctrina Jacobi, which is a document written in 634 CE. It is the first historical mention of a prophet among the Saracens, the Arabs. It is what historians call a very high-quality source because it's near contemporary to the events that it describes, and it's by a man who got the information from his brother, who is an eyewitness to the Arab conquest. And it is a very accurate retelling of the events mentioned. It mentions that a prophet has appeared among the Saracens, and he is preaching the arrival of the Messiah. Of course, there is religiously charged language in it as well. For instance, the brother, Abraham, is talking to an old man whom he asked about the Saracen prophet, and he says that the Saracen prophet is false because prophets don't come with a sword and a war chariot. Clearly, the old man never met Niccolo Machiavelli. However, then Abraham says that he talked to some people who had met him, and they said that we found no truth in this so-called prophet, only the shedding of human blood. Now, the source makes it quite clear that Abraham lived in Syria, and this event takes place in February 634, when Prophet Muhammad is supposed to have been gone for almost 2 years. So who are these people who live in Syria and who have met the prophet and have nothing but bad things to say about him? The language also suggests that they might have been victims of the Arab conquest and were hence quite resentful about it. So this source does raise that question. I know some people in the comments are going to misunderstand this and say, well, these might have been people who knew the prophet from back in his trading days because before Islam he did trade in Syria. But if that was really the case, these people would have certainly mentioned that we knew this prophet back in the day. Now, this doesn't tell us for sure that Prophet Muhammad was indeed in Palestine, of course. Stephen Shoemaker also acknowledges this and says that we cannot establish that these people, these eyewitnesses, weren't merely confusing a general of the Rashidun Caliphate with Prophet Muhammad. Since these people were followers of Prophet Muhammad, maybe they confused the names of their leaders. Then we have a text called The Secrets of Rabbi Simon ben Yochai, which is what's called an apocalyptic text. It dates to the Crusades when it was reworked based on older sources. It was written around the time of the Abbasid Revolution, but that was also based on earlier sources, likely contemporary to the Arab conquest. Now, it deals with prophecies related to the apocalypse, which are told to Simon by the angel Metatron, which is an actual angel. I thought he was a transformer. The angel tells him that the Ishmaelites would conquer the Holy Land and free it from the Romans, which to Jews was good news because around that time the Byzantine Empire had been oppressing the Jews. The primary version of the document, as compiled by Robert Hoyland, says that an Ishmaelite prophet would rise up and he would conquer the Holy Land and restore it to greatness. This clearly puts Prophet Muhammad as a messiah for the Jews. However, there are other versions of this text that aren't that nice to the prophet. One version that comes from the Cairo Geniza documents instead says that the prophet will be crazy and possessed by a spirit and he will conquer the Holy Land for the Arabs. These prophecies were written after the events that they describe, so they should be understood by us as talking about the past, not the future, and it tells us that Prophet Muhammad conquered Palestine for the Arabs and freed the Jews. Now, this document has been through some editing, and so the quality of the source isn't very high. But still, the fact that all versions of the document preserve that the Ishmaelite prophet would rise up and free the Holy Land from the Romans seems to indicate that whatever the original source was had this part as well. Now, the next source is quite interesting. It's a chart of events composed by one Jacob or James of Edessa, who puts historical events on a table, basically the useful charts of his day. In it, he puts Prophet Muhammad, the first king of the Saracens, as beginning his rule in the year 620/21 and having ruled for 7 years, passing away in 627 or 28. Now that's of course obnoxious. It doesn't line up with any other sources. It puts the Prophet's death some 4 to 5 years earlier than it should be. However, this date has an interesting wrinkle. 4 or 5 years after beginning the reign of Prophet Muhammad, the chart mentions that the Arabs began to make raids into Palestine before the death of the Prophet. Most notably, it tells us that Prophet Muhammad passed away in the 19th year of Heraclius' reign, which would be 629 or so, which was also the year that Khosrow II died according to the chart. Now that part is actually almost accurate. Khosrow II died in 628. Stephen Shoemaker, in my opinion, is kind of making a big deal out of this because after looking at the original source, it's easier to believe that the writer just made a mistake rather than some kind of evidence for Prophet Muhammad's prolonged vitality, if you will. He later writes accurate dates for other kings and emperors and makes up for the lost 4 to 5 years of Prophet Muhammad's life by adding years to other people. For example, Umar ibn al-Khattab in his chart reigned for 12 years. However, in reality, he died after 10 years of reign. The raid that this chart mentions that occurred before the Prophet's death could simply be the Battle of Mota, which took place between the Arabs and a so-called Roman army in 629. However, this battle wasn't really significant to the Byzantine Empire. The so-called Roman army was actually not even Roman. It was likely Christian Arab and other tribes that were on Byzantine payroll rather than actual Byzantine soldiers from Anatolia or something. The Khuzestan Chronicle, which was written around 660, talks about the Arabs, and that part is actually based on likely eyewitness accounts of the Arab conquest of Persia. It doesn't explicitly mention the Prophet as being there at the invasion, but it mentions that God raised the sons of Ishmael against the Persians, and their leader was Muhammad. The structure of the document can suggest that Prophet Muhammad was actually leading the army, but it's really not very clear. It is simply too ambiguous to be taken as direct evidence. Then we have the history of the Patriarchs of Alexandria. This text is kind of a living text because it's the history of the Patriarchs of Alexandria, and it was first composed in late antiquity but was updated over the centuries. Its last update was actually in 1942. The part that talks about the Arab invasions was likely written around 717 CE because it ends with the reign of Umayyad Caliph Suleiman, who died in 717 CE. That part clearly puts Prophet Muhammad in Damascus, having crossed the Jordan River, and mentions that the Roman army was abandoned by God in front of him. Conspicuously missing from this document is anti-Islamic religious rhetoric. It's certainly hostile to the Romans, but it's not at all hostile to the Arabs. That raises the question that if the author had no intention of disparaging Islam, then why did he put Prophet Muhammad in Damascus? It doesn't even try to make him look like some kind of warlord, as some other sources do. During the early days of Islamic rule in Spain, 2 documents were written in Latin: the Byzantine Arab Chronicle of 741 and the Hispanic Chronicle of 754. These documents are actually the only Latin documents about early Islam and are also the only known documents written in Latin during the 7 or so centuries of Islamic rule in southern Spain. The Byzantine Arab Chronicle was likely based on some source that was written in Syria during the days of the Umayyad Caliphate, because it has all the telltale signs of being written under Umayyad eyes. It's favorable to all Umayyad caliphs, including Yazid ibn Muawiyah, and it has no mentions of Ali ibn Abi Talib. The Hispanic Chronicle also uses the same original source, so these texts are sister texts. The Byzantine Arab Chronicle clearly puts Prophet Muhammad as being the leader of the Saracens who invaded Syria, Arabia, and Mesopotamia. It then mentions the conquest of Syria and then the death of Prophet Muhammad, who was succeeded by one Abu Bakr of the Saracens, who organized a massive campaign against the Persians. This source also doesn't say anything bad against Prophet Muhammad. It's very positive for a Christian source, but what about the original source? Who wrote that? Well, we're not sure. If it was a Christian, he was very nice to the Muslims, but still, he did call their rise a rebellion, which a Muslim wouldn't have. So it's difficult to say for sure whether it was actually a Muslim or a Christian who wrote the original source. It's certainly possible that it was a Christian who was under the influence of the Umayyad Caliphate. Now, what's interesting is that it breaks the chronology of the Arab conquests into two parts. It puts Syria as having been conquered by Prophet Muhammad and then Persia by Abu Bakr. But in reality, Damascus fell in 634, and in the same year, 634, the Muslims lost the Battle of the Bridge in Iraq. Then in 637, Ctesiphon, the capital of the Persians, fell. These two conquests were happening simultaneously, and people were even being moved between them as needed. So they weren't two distinct events being led by two separate leaders. The Hispanic Chronicle of 754 clearly takes a different approach. It's more negative towards the Muslims and clearly has a religious bend in its writing. It tells us that the Saracens rebelled in 618 and took over Syria, Arabia, and Mesopotamia, not by power of their leader, Muhammad, but by trickery. Interestingly, it tells that the Arabs were indeed subjects of the Byzantine Empire and they fought against them and shook the yoke from their necks. It also then goes on to mention the death of the Prophet and then the Caliphate of Abu Bakr, who then invaded Persia. The dates in this document are off though. Prophet Muhammad passed away in 628 CE according to this document, like the charts mentioned before. The Chronicle of Theophilus of Edessa is a lost source that has been preserved by two later sources. The date of this chronicle is around 750 or so because it only goes as far as 754, but the dates can be a bit tricky. Nevertheless, it is from around that time. The author, Theophilus of Edessa, is actually a very fascinating character. He was an astrologer and studied a lot of Greek sources and allegedly translated them into Syriac, including the Iliad and the Odyssey, although those translations, if they ever existed, are now lost. He also served in the court of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mahdi, who was the father of the famous Harun al-Rashid. This chronicle goes into a bit of detail about the Prophet and is the first source that we've encountered that talks about him before he became a prophet as well. It tells us that he used to go up to Palestine as a merchant, but instead of Mecca, it mentions his city as Yathrib, which was later renamed to Medina. Then, after he became a prophet, he began raiding Palestine himself. But then, as the movement grew stronger, he commanded them from Yathrib and didn't lead them personally. Then they forced the Palestinians to pay tribute and eventually defeated the Romans and the Persians. Now, it's possible that Theophilus was working with two different sources. One that said that Prophet Muhammad led the army to Palestine, and one that said that he didn't, and maybe he found a way to reconcile the two by specifically mentioning that he stayed back in Yathrib during the later raids. The short Syriac Chronicle of 775 is written by an unknown author who gives us a chronology of the major events of early Islam. In the year 933 of Alexander, Muhammad and the Arabs went forth from the south and entered the land of Syria and took control of it. Now, the year 933 of Alexander is actually the year 618 or 19 of the Julian calendar. This is way too early. The Prophet Muhammad was in Mecca at the time. He didn't have a state at the time and only a handful of followers. He certainly didn't have an army to invade Syria. Nevertheless, despite the chronological problems with this source, it does clearly state that Prophet Muhammad was there when Syria was invaded. The Zuqnin Chronicle is another source from around that time and is also riddled with chronological errors for this period. However, the author acknowledges that and says that he couldn't find a reliable source for this period. Nevertheless, he also mentions that the Arabs invaded Palestine in 621 and their first king was a man named Muhammad, whom they called a prophet and under whose leadership they defeated the Romans in battle. After this, according to this source, the conquest seems to have paused and only continued with the reign of Umar, with Abu Bakr ruling for 5 years after the prophet. Of course, that's not true. Abu Bakr reigned for less than 2 years. This source was compiled in 1355 by Abul Fath al-Samari al-Danafi. Abul Fath's original work only extended to around the Prophet's childhood, when, interestingly, 3 astrologers, one Jewish, one Christian, and one Samaritan, discerned from the stars that Prophet Muhammad had arrived, and so they went to find him and met him and identified the signs on his back. This story is different from the one that's more famous with the monk Bahira, a Christian who recognized the Prophet as a child and knew that he was a prophet. The parts after this, especially into the early Islamic period, were later appendages to the chronicle by some anonymous author. The author tells us that Prophet Muhammad and his army went to war against the Byzantines and conquered the land. Interestingly, the source then singles out Caesarea as having been particularly difficult for the Arabs to conquer, who besieged it for 6 years. He also gives a very accurate description of the city during the Byzantine era, so perhaps the author was more familiar with this city. This indicates that the later addition to the chronicle was based on a previous, much older source because of the details in the work. Anyhow, this source also puts Prophet Muhammad there in Syria and Palestine. One of the most interesting correspondences of the early 8th century was the letters between Byzantine Emperor Leo and Umayyad Caliph Umar II. These letters were apparently written by Umar to Leo as a means to invite him to Islam, but it started a bit of a debate between the two where they accused each other's religion of being false. Leo, in this case, had remarkable knowledge of Islam's inner workings. For example, he tells Umar II that the Quran was written by Caliph Umar, Abu Turab, that is Ali ibn Abi Talib, and Salman the Persian. He also mentions that it was Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, the Umayyad governor of Iraq, who compiled it together and tried to eliminate all influences of Abu Turab, but he failed at that. Now, that's an indication that Leo knew about the Shia-Sunni rivalry even that early on. The letter's authenticity is up in the air. There are many opinions about them because they're reconstructed from multiple sources and the chain of transmission has some problems in it. Plus, I couldn't actually find the original translations online to read them myself, so I'm basically just going to tell you what Stephen Shoemaker writes. In the letter, at one point, Umar II mentions that Prophet Muhammad led his followers out of Arabia against the Byzantines and the Persians. Stephen Shoemaker didn't put this part in quotation marks, so it's not a direct quote. I wanted to read the letters myself and see what other scholars write about it, but I hit a dead end. Anyhow, then Shoemaker quotes the letter as saying, "In this way, with him in whom we trust and in whom we believed, we went off barefoot, naked, without equipment, strength, weapon, or provisions to fight against the largest empires." Now, the part that's supposed to say that Prophet Muhammad was there is this one. With him in whom we trust. That doesn't necessarily mean Prophet Muhammad, but rather could easily mean God. Shoemaker, however, insisted that this means Prophet Muhammad. This would hence be the only Islamic source that puts Prophet Muhammad in battle against the Byzantines. So those were the 11 sources mentioned by Stephen Shoemaker in his book Death of a Prophet. Now, it should be made clear that Stephen Shoemaker is being more generous than any other scholar when it comes to these sources. For example, some of these sources aren't accepted by Patricia Crona and Robert Hoyland as being evidentiary of the Prophet's role in the invasion of Palestine. Also, Shoemaker's book came out in 2011, and so far its central thesis has not been widely accepted by scholars on either side of the aisle. Hoyland, for example, explains away these Christian writings as being attempts to highlight the Prophet Muhammad as more of a warlord than a prophet, because prophets, at least in the Christian mind, don't lead armies. It can also simply be that an incorrect tradition that identified the leaders of the Arab invasions as the Prophet simply stayed around for quite a while and found their way into sources that otherwise weren't trying to paint a negative view of the Prophet. The mistaken part of this explanation shouldn't be taken lightly because, as we've seen, some of these sources were pretty bad at recording chronology and put Prophet Muhammad's death 5 to 10 years even before his actual death in 632. Another explanation could be that the Arab invasions did actually begin under the command of the Prophet himself. There were two events during the Prophet's lifetime where his followers interacted with the Romans: the Battle of Mu'tah and the expedition to Tabuk. If those battles represent a larger plan for a northward invasion, then technically we can say that the Arab invasions did actually begin in the Prophet's lifetime, and the later invasions were actually a part of that effort rather than being a separate event. This could also explain why the new Muslim polity under the Prophet's immediate successors was so adamant about invading the northern empires. Within 2 years of the Prophet's death, the Arabs were within spitting distance of Damascus and Ctesiphon. If the mission was started by Prophet Muhammad himself, then his successors would certainly want to see it to its completion. There's also the famous expedition of Usama ibn Zayd. Usama's expedition was actually put together by the Prophet himself to march up north and meet the Romans on the battlefield, but the Prophet passed away before the army left. Abu Bakr dispatched the army soon after, so that shows that the empire was ready to face the Byzantine Empire itself. We'll discuss that in the next video. Finally, there's also the fact that the Prophet's biography wasn't exactly as clear early on as it became with, for example, Muhammad ibn Ishaq's biography of the Prophet of Allah in the 760s. Ma'mar ibn Rashid, who wrote a book about the Prophet's expeditions slightly earlier than Muhammad ibn Ishaq, puts the expedition of Hudaybiyah, an event that took place in 628 CE, before he did the Battle of Badr, which was likely 4 years earlier. So the question of the Prophet's life and its chronology is certainly not resolved, and it certainly wasn't resolved before Muhammad ibn Ishaq tried to resolve it. Before I finish, I'd like to say that, of course, I'm no expert on this, and people more qualified than me should be consulted and read for this, but I have studied enough of this topic to have an opinion, and in my humble and not nearly qualified opinion, the idea that at some point heavy editing was done to Islamic sources to fit a certain narrative is frankly too far-fetched. The claim is that at some point Islam was turned from one thing to a drastically different thing, and all previous sources were discarded and even destroyed by editors. To me, a layman who has read a lot of books, that's never made sense. Fred Donner's work, for example, describes Islam as being different at its inception than it is today, but he doesn't try to re-evaluate facts, only their interpretation. It's understandable and even plausible that a set of scholars interpreted facts in a similar way, perhaps due to local traditions. But to say that they went so far as to remove all mentions of the Prophet being in Palestine, leading the army, is not very plausible. That would assume some kind of a larger attempt at crafting the narrative. Someone sat down and decided that it was more poetic for the Prophet's life to end with the conquest of Mecca rather than the conquest of Palestine. That someone then influenced all the scholars who came after him and edited the works of those who came before him. This just doesn't seem very plausible. Assuming that it happened under the Abbasids, we would still expect to find some alternative narratives that survived some kind of a massive purge. The Quran, for example, was standardized by Uthman in the 640s, and he destroyed all the variants he could find, but we have still found other variants of the Quran, despite Uthman's best efforts and despite the fact that Uthman ruled all of the Islamic world while the Abbasids didn't. There were independent polities in Spain, Morocco, and India. So The whole editing angle doesn't make much sense, at least to me, and not many revisionists have given us a more convincing chronology of when this editing must have taken place. As a result of that, I'm usually skeptical when some kind of a bombshell comes forth and tries to change facts about Islam that are considered solid at this point. Editing of this level simply doesn't seem plausible, and letting these pieces of evidence, which also have other mistakes, drastically change the narrative of early Islam is, in my opinion, missing the forest for the trees. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon. On the screen right now, you can see the names and tiers of the patrons. You can join them by pledging $1 or more to support the channel. Thank you for watching.